There once was a very pretty little girl with blue eyes and yellow curls and a big bow in her hair. Her name was Ivy Lou. Her parents gave her everything she asked for. They were very rich, you see, and could afford to do so. It was not very long before Ivy Lou entirely ran out of ordinary things to ask for. She had far more dolls than she could possibly find time to play with, and far more toys of every sort than any other child around. She had more clothes than she could ever wear, with a pair of shoes to match each and every dress. There were velvet shoes and corduroy shoes, silk shoes, satin shoes, lace shoes, and flowered shoes, and plaid shoes and polka dot shoes. There was a hair ribbon to match each and every shoe, a coat to match each and every hair ribbon, a hat to match each and every coat, and a parasol to match each and every hat. There were closets and closets in that house, and every one of them was filled with Ivy Lou's clothes. Of course, there was no room in any of the closets for her parents' clothes. There was only a very small place left for them in the cellar near the horse's stall. Yes, Ivy Lou had a black and white horse in the cellar. This was a result of a sudden fancy of hers that had come first to her in a dream. She fed the horse by dropping shredded wheat biscuits through the laundry chute when she remembered. Because she had begged for it, she and her parents lived in a wonderful old house that had an old-fashioned chute down which you could throw your clothes so they would land in the basement where the washing machine was. When Ivy Lou did not remember to feed the horse, which was quite often, her mother did it or her father. They took the horse out for daily airings, too, around the block, for it was too much difficult for Ivy Lou to get him up the cellar stairs. She was not a very patient child, you see. But Ivy Lou was talented. Yes, she was well known far and wide for the well-practiced tantrums that she threw when she did not get her way. They were absolutely the very worst tantrums, everyone agreed, that had ever been thrown on that street or indeed in the entire city. Tantrum number 1 was the mildest. Ivy Lou used it when she wanted something only a little bit because she was feeling rather bored. Quite often, she did not care to go to school, and the days stretched long and dull through the echoing, ticking rooms of that enormous house. Here is what she would do. She would begin spinning around and round the room, make a low humming sound in her throat, which rose to a shriek, and then to a most terrifying roar, and then stamp her feet over and over again. Next, she would open her pretty pink mouth as wide as possible, and this had become very wide indeed from long practice, and she would shout so loudly that all the fancy chandeliers in the house would sway back and forth, creaking horribly upon their chains, their crystal prisms tinkling in alarm and tossing nervous darting flashes of light all over the house and even out into the street. The little stiff gold chairs which stood in lines against the walls of the parlor like soldiers waiting to be called to duty for any party Ivy Lou might suddenly desire, trembled in all their limbs. Quite often, 1 or 2 of them fell right over, their little spindly legs sticking up mathematically in the air. Outside the parlor, the birds would leap from the trees till the sky was dark with them. All the cats in town would shriek for cover. Then Ivy Lou would close her mouth, hold her breath, turn purple and green, spin around 3 times, and fall over with a horrible scream, which caused the walls to crack and perhaps a chandelier or 2 to fall. Her parents and anyone else who was in the room always kept to the edges of the room, along with the shivering golden chairs. Now the walls would crack, and more chandeliers and other hanging objects would fall, not only in Ivy Lou's own house, but in all the houses up and down the street. So the neighbors, too, had learned to keep close to the walls most of the time for maximum safety. Her father spent a good deal of money on the repair of neighbors' homes, for he was an upright man and fair and very rich besides. And that was how it was that Ivy Lou had a playhouse in the backyard that was bigger than their real house, with a television set in every room and a real refrigerator and a real stove. But she soon grew bored with that. One day, Ivy Lou thought she would like a small red car of her own to drive about in, and a throughway in the backyard with a clover leaf and real traffic signals. "But dear," said her mother, "I'm not sure it would be safe, or even legal," said her father, looking worried. So Ivy Lou said, "Tantrum number 2, coming up." She sometimes announced her tantrums, you see. This tantrum was for when she was feeling not just bored, but horribly frustrated besides. She was also tired this time, for she had not felt like going to bed for several nights. First she screamed in that horrible way, and then she began to turn purple, taking quite a long time about it under system number 2, so that it began to seem to those neighbors who could hear but not see her that she might not go on with it this time. But just as the birds were beginning to lower themselves gingerly back into their nests, and the little gold chairs had settled down, and the eyes of the cats were showing here and there from behind gooseberry bushes and over the tops of rain barrels, why then she would suddenly dart from the room, knock over vases of colored thistles and small china shepherdesses as she went, and storm up the stairs, down the stairs, and slam doors until the pictures and bits of plaster and keys and shepherdesses and thistles flew in a perfect snow about the house. At such times there was a terrible ruckus and furor, with Ivy Lou's parents wringing their hands and following her about the house, up the stairs, down the stairs, leafing through the latest books on child care, and asking one another if they ought to give in this time. Then, to the horror of the neighbors, who had taken cover by now along with the birds and the cats, Ivy Lou would leap into the small airplane she kept in her room and soar out of the window. She would zoom down into her parents' garden to knock over the phlox and the geraniums and the delphiniums, and then into the neighbors' gardens where she had a go at the chrysanthemums and the dahlias and the hydrangeas. She left bleeding tomato patches in her wake and stricken lilac bushes lying on their sides. She even reached down from the cockpit and gleefully uprooted carrots and beets and flung them about. She was a very skillful pilot. At last, all the stunned neighbors would look out the rain barrels or wherever they had gone for cover and shout together, "Give it to her!" And of course her parents always did. They always gave her whatever she wanted at last. And that is how she came to be the owner of the little red car and the throughway and the clover leaf and traffic signals. But of course no one thought Ivy Lou would be satisfied for long, and they were right. Very soon she wanted a boat with sails and a crew of pirates, and of course a lake and a beach too to go with the boat. For what could you do with a boat if you had no lake in which to sail it? Her parents had to admit the logic of it. "At least," whispered her mother, "she didn't ask for an ocean. She isn't nearly as unreasonable as they say." "Shh," warned her father, fearing that Ivy Lou would ask for an ocean if she heard, and he cleared his throat. "Ivy Lou," he said timidly, "I don't really know how to go about finding pirates." Her mother grasped her father's hand with her own trembling small white hand. "Oh no," she whispered, "she's getting the look." For this was the third and very worst tantrum of all, the thing she didn't do. "Tantrum number 3, hissed Ivy Lou from between clenched teeth. She only used number 3 as a very last resort when she wanted something so very much that she could not be bothered to take the time and effort required for all that other fun and display. First, she grew very calm. Her blue eyes turned cold as ice, and then she said in a rather quiet and rather friendly voice, "I'm going to turn myself inside out." Then she would puff out her cheeks in a most alarming manner. At this, her parents would agree to anything at all, very quickly, for they could not bear to think how it would be to see Ivy Lou turn herself inside out. They knew very well that she could easily do it. One of the neighbors, a very cranky old man indeed, suggested one day that they let her do it, and of course her mother and father never spoke to him again. "He doesn't understand children," said her mother, sniffling and touching a hanky with a pink tatted edge to her eyes at the thought of the unfeeling people in the world. "Not children like our Ivy Lou," agreed Daddy staunchly, patting his wife's shoulder. When Ivy Lou was not behaving in these various ways, she could really be a rather pleasant child, though not often. Only her father and mother knew about that. At any rate, she got her pirate ship and the lake and the beach and even the pirates. Her father inserted an advertisement in the help wanted section of the local newspaper and soon had a crew of 5 quite authentic and colorful pirates who could often be seen skulking around the garden with cutlasses in their teeth. Sometimes they sat in the pansy bed, squinting horribly, with any eyes not covered by black patches and embroidering skulls and crossbones on pirate flags. After a while, they were not so very rich as they had been before. Her father said that maybe he'd have to go back to work again, but Ivy Lou said, "Tantrum number 2, coming up," and began to go purple, and her mother nervously patted her curls and said, "Please, dear," to her husband in such a pleading voice that of course he said he was sorry and continued to stay home. Ivy Lou said he was a good daddy, and he felt very happy. And so things went on that way for some time until one day, when they were all feeling rather bored, a witch came by. When she shortly grew tired of all that, Ivy Lou managed to persuade her parents to begin celebrating Christmas every day. They took down the old Christmas tree after dinner every evening, and while Ivy Lou was sleeping, they put up a new one. It rather amused her for a time. They gave her a birthday party every day for a while with a 5-layer cake and candles and lots of presents. But no one ever came to the parties, though they sent out invitations every day to all the neighborhood children. For Ivy Lou had no friends at all. No one ever rang her doorbell to ask her to play. No one ever called her on the phone. No one ever came home from school with her. She was very lonely, and her parents could not understand it at all. They were terribly concerned about her. They hated to see her walking about and sighing to herself. "We've given her everything," they said. "We want her to have a happy childhood." But could be wrong? The other children on the street lived in very ordinary houses, white with green shutters or green with white shutters, and they did not nearly have the number of lovely toys and clothes Ivy Lou had, and you would have thought they would have been delighted to play with her and her toys, but they were not. Their parents said that Ivy Lou was spoiled. The children said that Ivy Lou was bossy. "Ridiculous," said Ivy Lou's father. Finally, her father stopped going to work and stayed home to play with Ivy Lou because she asked him to. In fact, her mother had done the same thing a few months before. The witch had heard about Ivy Lou, and having her own reasons for wishing to see her, she came to apply for a job. She was quite an authentic witch, they could see, with a green face and red eyes and a black pointed hat and a black cloak and, of course, a broomstick. After every 5th word, she cackled most satisfactorily. Ivy Lou was perfectly delighted with her. The witch said that if they hired her, she would make some magic children to play with Ivy Lou. She showed the family a few samples when Ivy Lou's father, who had once been a very good businessman, asked her if she would do so to help them decide. Here is how she did it. First, she took from under her cloak some magic knitting needles and some black yarn, and she began to knit very fast. Her needles moved so fast that after a while, Ivy Lou could not even see them at all. "How pretty," said Ivy Lou. "How clever," said Daddy. "Where did you learn to knit so well?" asked Mommy. The witch cackled, but put away the needles, tied a magic knot in the yarn, picked up the scarf, waved it, and out stepped 3 little girls, as real as they could be. The rest of the scarf simply disappeared. "Wonderful," said Daddy. "Amazing," said Mommy. Ivy Lou had already begun to order the children about, and what delightful companions they were. They laughed, shouted, clapped their hands, and ran about, but only when Ivy Lou ordered them to. They were not at all like the ordinary children in the ordinary houses, and they seemed to think that Ivy Lou was just as wonderful. Ivy Lou was happier than she had been in ever so many years. Tears of joy stood in her parents' eyes as they watched her frolicking with the little magic children. After a time, however, the magic children disappeared, for of course they were only temporary samples and had not been paid for. "The regular ones," said the witch, "are even better. They laugh more, they run and shout more, they know all sorts of games no one has ever heard of before, and of course they are very obedient." Ivy Lou looked at her parents with her big blue eyes, and her yellow curls danced, and there were roses in her cheeks that her parents had not seen for ever so long. "Oh, please, Mommy and Daddy," Ivy Lou pleaded. "Please hire the witch." Mommy looked at Daddy. "We're almost out of money," said Daddy. Mommy gave him a look. Ivy Lou began to cry. She began to puff out her cheeks. Poor Daddy, he just felt awful. Ivy Lou puffed out her cheeks even more. Her mother sat down in one of the golden chairs so as to steady herself. "How much money do you have, Daddy?" asked the witch. Daddy told her. "That's enough," said the witch, and so they hired her. Well, after that, the witch moved in. Everything changed, but not at all in the way that they had hoped. All the neighbors said that they had been foolish to trust the witch, but it was too late by then. Here's what happened. The witch brought 56 suitcases with her, and every one of them was filled with balls of black yarn. Of course, Ivy Lou and her mommy and daddy were ever so happy to see that, because they thought that the witch could make a great many magic children with so much yarn, and if few of them turned out to be unsatisfactory, then surely would be some in all that number to please them. As the witch had unpacked the yarn, she brought it all down to the living room and sat in Daddy's favorite chair. Indeed, it was the only chair left to sit in, for the rest of the chairs were filled with the overflow from Ivy Lou's toy shelves. The witch took out her magic needles and began to knit. Mommy and Daddy and Ivy Lou sat on the floor and watched. The black scarf grew longer and longer and longer. When it had grown so big that it almost filled the whole room, Mommy said very politely, "It's a very big scarf, isn't it?" Daddy said rather apologetically, "Do we need so many children?" Perhaps he was a little worried about feeding them all, the money situation being what it was. But Ivy Lou looking very closely at the scarf, and she said, "Why, there aren't any children at all. It's only a picture of a horrid little hut." She was quite right. The colors were growing clear, and they could all see that the picture was a picture of a horrid little hut with cobwebs on the windows. Ivy Lou was too surprised to even begin a tantrum. "See here," said Daddy. "What about the children?" asked Mommy. They touched the scarf, and with that, Mommy and Daddy simply disappeared. And as if that weren't bad enough, Ivy Lou's whole beautiful house began to disappear too, bit by bit, and all her toys and her pretty clothes, and the horse and the cellar and the playhouse and the television sets and the lake and the beach and the car and the thruway and the boat and the pirates and the airplane, everything, in short, that there had been in that yard and in the house, disappeared. Ivy Lou complained quite bitterly, but the witch only cackled, tied another magic knot, picked up the scarf, and gave it a tremendous shake. And with that, Ivy Lou found herself living in the horrid little hut at the end of the street of green and white houses, with the witch, a black cat, and the witch's best broomstick parked near the front door. Ivy Lou's big blue eyes filled with tears, and the roses faded from her cheeks. But there was no one to care. The witch didn't care one bit. Ivy Lou narrowed her blue eyes at the witch. She took a deep, furious breath. "I'm going to have tantrum number 1, she said. But the witch only stared horribly back at her with her fiery red eyes and cackled and said, "Go ahead. I have been wanting to see this. I've heard about it. I suppose I'll have to sit through the preliminaries to get to the finale." And she leaned on her broom and waited. Ivy Lou, though restricted by the small quarters of the horrid little hut, put on a first-class tantrum number 1. She howled and she shouted, she purpled and she greened, she fell and she screamed and she stamped, and the cobwebs came down and the window panes cracked and the pots and pans set up a deafening tin, and above all, over the horrid little hut, dust rose in swirls and eddies, and at last a beam came loose and crashed to the floor. But the witch only grinned with her pointy teeth and cackled and held her creaky old sides. When Ivy Lou lay exhausted at last on the floor, unable to do any more, the witch said, "Not bad, dearie, not bad at all. We may make a witch's child of you yet. Needs a little touching up here and there. I suggest a few little artistic variations later on. Now let's see number 2. Ivy Lou explained that she needed her airplane for this one, but the witch offered the use of her broomstick instead and helped her aboard. Seeing as the witch had no reaction to Ivy Lou's turning purple and green or screaming in any horrible way, she did away with this part of number 2 and concentrated instead on trying to control the broom. Now, the trouble was Ivy Lou found that she could not control it at all, but was carried hither and yon without any direction on her part. It took her into the neighbors' gardens, however, and allowed her to uproot flowers and vegetables, as she's always done, and it even took her through some open windows and into rooms full of startled people, who waved their fists and shouted as she zoomed past them and out another window, knocking over vases and china figures as she went. At last the broom brought her back to the witch. Ivy Lou thought this was great fun, but would have rather liked to control the broom a little more. The witch promised her that someday she would. Ivy Lou began to think just a little bit that perhaps staying with the witch wouldn't be so bad after all. "Now," said the witch, when she had put the broom away in a closet with a number of others, "now I'll show you a thing or two." And with that she turned herself into a tornado and sucked up all the houses and people in town and whirled them around and put them back so quickly that no one but Ivy Lou noticed that anything had happened. Then the witch shouted such a terrible shout it was that it uprooted every single tree in town. And when that was done, she gave another shout that was even more terrifying than the first, and that shout put all the trees back in the ground again. Ivy Lou began to feel very discouraged. "I'll never be that good," she thought. And the witch didn't even want anything. And because she was tired and jealous and missing her comfortable home and her parents, Ivy Lou threatened, "Bring back my throughway and my house and my mommy and my daddy, or I won't go to school or eat or do anything you want me to ever again." "You're a love," cried the witch, pinching Ivy Lou's cheek with bony old fingers. "Now, my dearie, down to business. I've heard tell of tantrum number 3. That's the one I really want to see." "No," said Ivy Lou. "Let me go." "Come now, dearie. Turn yourself inside out." "No," said Ivy Lou, stamping her feet. "Turn yourself inside out, dearie, or I'll turn you into a porcelain pig," said the witch. "No," said Ivy Lou, shaking her curls and sticking out her lower lip. So the witch turned her into a porcelain pig, and it was perfectly terrible. Ivy Lou did not like being a porcelain pig at all, and when the witch turned her back into Ivy Lou, she burst into tears and confessed, "I can't turn myself inside out." "Ha!" cried the witch. "Just what I thought. Now watch this." And to Ivy Lou's horror, the witch turned herself inside out. It was the most horrible sight that Ivy Lou had ever seen, and she was greatly relieved when the witch stopped being inside out. "Someday you'll be able to do that," promised the witch. "I hope not," said Ivy Lou. She sat on the floor of the cobwebby old hut, feeling very sorry for herself. She was afraid that she would be turned into a porcelain pig again if she did not do what the witch told her to do, but she did not want to turn herself inside out, ever. "I wish I had never thought of that," she said to herself. Ivy Lou felt very sad. She had never been treated like this in all her life, and she did not know what to do. While she was sitting there feeling sorry for herself, she happened to notice a very little glittering something beside her on the floor. It looked odd there in the dark, cobwebby old hut, and indeed it was. It happened that it was the only thing besides Ivy Lou that had come through from their house. It looked like a little star to Ivy Lou, because it was such a pretty little thing and reminded her somehow of the way things used to be when she had lived in the big house with her mommy and her daddy and all her pretty toys. She reached out, scooped it up, and slipped it into her pocket. It was a very good thing that the witch did not see Ivy Lou do that, for would not have wanted the little star around if she had known. For here it was really what it was, not a star at all, but the very last kiss that Ivy Lou's silly but loving mommy had given her the night before when she had tucked her into bed. How it managed not to disappear along with everything else I do not know, unless perhaps being so small it had slipped through a dropped stitch in the witch's knitting. At any rate, there it lay, safe for the moment at the bottom of Ivy Lou's pocket. Ivy Lou very soon forgot about the little star. She had too much on her mind, what with trying to figure out what to do about the witch. The neighbors were no help at all. They said it served her right, and how they would not allow their children to play in a witch's house with a witch's child, though the children would not have minded at all. They thought it might be rather exciting. And as for the magic children, the witch had promised she never produced another one after those samples. "You promised," said Ivy Lou, but the witch did not seem at all moved, as Ivy Lou's mommy and daddy had been, by big blue eyes or yellow curls. Of course, Ivy Lou's ribbon had grown rather bedraggled by now, and her hair needed brushing. But all the brushes had disappeared with the house, and all other hair ribbons, too. Quite soon, Ivy Lou began to forget that she had ever been anything but a witch's child. The memory of her parents and her pretty house and all her lovely toys began to fade away, and if she remembered them occasionally, it was only very, very faintly, and as if they were something she had dreamed a long time ago. The neighbors, too, forgot very soon that Ivy Lou had ever lived any other way. It was just as if the witch's hut had always been there, at the corner of the street, with a thorny tangle of bushes around it, and scraggly lawn of witch hazel and panic grass. It may be that the witch brought some magic forgetting spell upon them all. She was quite capable of that. The witch was as wicked to Ivy Lou as a witch could be. She made Ivy Lou work from morning till night, cleaning and scrubbing, which never did any good no matter how hard she tried, for as soon as Ivy Lou had turned her back, the cobwebs and dust came creeping back in, and everything was just as it had been before. It was terribly discouraging, but Ivy Lou had to do it, for the witch threatened to turn her into a porcelain pig again if she did not do everything she was told to. For the truth was, the witch had gone to all that trouble to get Ivy Lou so that she could train her to be a witch's child. She had never intended to keep her promise at all. Ivy Lou tried her very best. She put green powder on her face every single morning, just as the witch ordered her to do. She was a very bossy witch. And the witch, though she seemed rather discouraged by Ivy Lou's big blue eyes and yellow curls, claimed that she could see some change in Ivy Lou, and that she was growing every day to look more and more like a proper witch's child. Ivy didn't know whether this was so or not, for there were no mirrors at all in the horrid little hut, and all the pots and pans were burnt black as black could be, so she could not even peek into them. Ivy Lou learned to make brooms for the witch, for her brooms wore out very quickly. This was no wonder at all, since she went soaring out the door on a broomstick every single night. Of course the door locked magically behind her, and Ivy Lou was left to sleep as best she could on prickly straw mattress on the floor near the fireplace. Goodness knows what the witch did on those nightly excursions. When she came back the next morning, she always brought a morning newspaper with her, and while she drank her cup of steaming witch's brew, she cackled over the paper and read aloud to Ivy Lou the choicest items about wars, famines, earthquakes, floods, accidents, and sickness. Ivy Lou felt bad, not so far as she knew because of the news, but because she could not seem to feel happy about the news, as the witch did. She knew that she was a very bad witch's child, or rather a very good witch's child, for as perhaps you know, good is bad when it comes to witches. Ivy Lou tried cackling like the witch, but it was a terrible failure. It came out more like a nervous giggle, and she could not see the witch was disappointed. Could see that the witch was disappointed in her. Yes, the witch was certainly disappointed in her, no matter what Ivy Lou did. She complained that the brooms were not right. They did not take turns at all well, and tended to skid on landing, and no matter how hard Ivy Lou tried to remedy this, the witch continued to complain quite bitterly. And as to the spells, the witch tried to teach Ivy Lou to cast magic spells. She told her the secret words and showed her how very easy it was to do the simpler spells, such as turning butterflies to stone and causing thunderstorms, and making the flowers in the gardens up and down the street shrivel away to nothing. But Ivy Lou, though she said the magic words, could not seem to make them work. "You don't really want to," the witch accused her, and Ivy Lou was afraid that this was so. The witch taught her to make magic potions and kept her standing over the stove all day long, stirring and stirring. Poor Ivy Lou really thought the potions smelled just awful, but she did not dare say anything. When the witch tasted the magic potions, she always said that Ivy Lou had not added enough powdered newt's foot or too many toadstools, and quite often there was nothing to do but pour out the whole batch. One day the witch unrolled a magnificent storm out from under her black cloak, threw it out the window, and cackled with glee as the way it roared and rumbled and splashed rain all over town, and spoiled the school picnic, which everyone had been looking forward to for weeks and weeks. Ivy Lou began to cry. The tears that rolled down her cheeks were colored green by the witch's powder, but Ivy Lou felt somehow that even so they were not the tears of a proper witch's child, and she knew that the witch was disappointed in her again. The truth was, she felt rather sorry for the children, though she sometimes watched through the cobweb windows when the witch was not at home, as they went back and forth to school and laughed and played together. She had even caught herself thinking once how nice it would be to be just an ordinary child and go to school and laugh and play. Of course, she could not tell the witch any of this. The witch was growing more and more discouraged with Ivy Lou. She said that she might have to turn her Ivy Lou into a porcelain pig again after all, if she did not improve. Oh, how Ivy Lou hoped that she would not be turned into a porcelain pig again. On Halloween, the witch told Ivy Lou that she would give her one more chance. I always feel generous on Halloween, she explained. She took out the magic knitting needles, which Ivy Lou had not seen her ever so long, and told her that she would show her how to use them. Ivy Lou's fingers were rather fumbling at first, but after a while she was able to make the black yarn go round and round the needles, and while she did not knit exactly nearly so fast as the witch, she was knitting. The witch told her that the needles would make a magic cloak, just like Ivy Lou's size, if she worked very hard and was careful not to drop a stitch. If she finished it by the stroke of midnight and placed it over her shoulders, she would immediately turn into a true witch's child. And if she did not finish it, a small porcelain ornament might go rather well up there, said the witch, pointing to a spot on the dusty mantle near the clock. Ivy Lou shuddered and very nearly dropped a stitch. But if she succeeded, "You'll have eyes like mine," said the witch. "That nasty blue will go." "Red?" asked Ivy Lou, knitting along as she talked. "Red," said the witch. "Red as fire, red as anger, and hair like mine. That ugly yellow will go." "Stringy?" asked Ivy Lou. "And straight and dust-colored black?" "Stringy," said the witch, touching her own lank locks with loving fingers. "Stringy and black, black as night, black as evil." Ivy Lou sighed to herself. She wished she would feel as she ought to, as a proper witch's child ought to feel. But there was something. Still, anything was better than being a porcelain pig on the dusty shelf mantel beside that hoarse old clock. Ivy Lou set to work again, harder than before. The witch chucked Ivy Lou under the chin with her skinny fingers, called her dearie and my sweet, and said that she would be back at midnight to see what happened. She left Ivy Lou sitting in the cinders by the fireplace, and she soared out the door on her broomstick. Click went the magic lock. Tick went the old clock, and the minutes ticked and talked by, and Ivy Lou's fingers flew as fast as they dared, for of course she was terribly afraid of dropping a stitch. The cape grew and grew, but not fast enough, not nearly fast enough. Faster and faster and faster Ivy Lou worked. Her fingers began to feel quite stiff, but she dared not stop. She began to feel oh so tired, but she dared not close her eyes. After a while she was feeling so very tired and so very stiff that she thought that just for a minute she would stand up and stretch. As she did so, though she did not notice it, the little star, which had been long ago forgotten about, fell out of her pocket right onto the knitting. When she sat down and went back to work again, she did not even see the little star, for it had fallen into the fold of the magic cape. Now it happened that this little star had a good deal of magic in it, not the witch's sort of magic, but good magic, and it may even be that the star in her pocket had kept Ivy Lou from becoming a successful witch's child. Ivy Lou soon began to realize that something was wrong. Imagine her horror when she saw that now, instead of knitting, she was unraveling. No matter how hard she tried to make the needles work right, they continued somehow to work backwards so that the cape was all coming undone. She found that she could not stop. Very soon that cape had only been a ball of black yarn again. Even now the needles did not stop. A piece of the yarn seemed to have caught on the edge of the ragged old rug that lay on the floor near the fireplace, and Ivy Lou watched in terror as her hands continued to work the needles and the rug began to slowly unravel and roll itself up into the ball of black yarn. "Oh dear," thought poor Ivy Lou, "what should I do?" "It's 11:15, said the clock on the mantel in a horrid old hoarse voice. "It'd be nice to have some company up here." When the rug was all unraveled, you might have thought, as Ivy Lou did, that there would be an end to it. Not at all. The needles went quite calmly on and began to unravel the floor. "The witch will be so mad," Ivy Lou told herself. She began to cry, though there was no one there to see or care. She had got to get up now, for the needles were beginning to pull her about the room, and she'd found some time before that it was impossible to let go of them. The rickety old chairs began to go now, and the tables, all of them, spinning into a big ball of yarn. If Ivy Lou's big blue eyes had not been so very full of tears, she would have seen sooner what was happening. As it was, she bumped quite suddenly into something hard. She peered at it through tears and saw that it was a very pretty chair with a flowered slipcover and a pile of toys on its seat. It was entirely unlike anything she had ever seen in the witch's horrid little hut, and yet it seemed somehow familiar to her. Faster and faster and faster the needles pulled her about, unraveling and unraveling, tables and chairs, walls and windows, cobwebs and brooms and pots and kettles, all of them rolling up into an enormous ball of yarn that followed her about as she ran. And where the witch's things had been, there were now several pretty chairs and tables and a flowered carpet. But still, Ivy Lou did not remember until... "Mommy and Daddy!" cried Ivy Lou, for there they were, standing where the witch's shelf of potions had been, and now she remembered everything. "Ivy Lou!" cried Mommy and Daddy. They were as glad as they could be to see one another again, and they kissed one another and hugged one another, which was rather difficult, for Mommy and Daddy had to follow Ivy Lou around the room as the needles pulled her here and there. "It was awful being enchanted like that," gasped Mommy. "My goodness, yes," said Daddy. "I hope it never happens again." Ivy Lou told them about the witch and midnight and the unraveling, and how she didn't want to be a porcelain pig at all, not a witch's child either, for only a little girl like all other little girls. Her parents told her that they were not rich at all anymore, and that they would have to live in a quite ordinary house. And was she sure? "I'm sure," Ivy Lou cried, "as sure as I can be." Daddy looked at the clock. 5 minutes, he cried. "You've only got 5 minutes." "I'll have to hurry then," said Ivy Lou, for there was still quite a lot of that horrid hut to unravel. She began to run about as fast as she could. "Hurry!" cried her parents. "Hurry!" She ran and she ran and she ran. She got tangled in the yarn and she fell, and once part of the hut began to come back because she somehow... But her parents helped her, and her mommy kissed her, and then she was able to work faster than ever. When the clock began to strike midnight in its horrible hoarse voice, there was still one corner of the hut to go, and her parents were pushing at the enormous ball of yarn to help her. On the 11th stroke, the witch came soaring in. "Stop!" the witch cried. "What are you doing to my horrid little hut?" But one more push and an enormous pull, and just as the clock struck the last stroke of midnight, every bit of that hut was gone, swallowed up in the tremendous ball of yarn, which then disappeared, and left Ivy Lou and her parents standing in their living room, with the witch coming in the front door, just as they had all been on that day when the witch had first applied for a job. But this time they said, "No, thank you, and we can't afford it, and goodbye," and then very firmly and politely showed her out the door and closed it behind her. The witch's hut and the witch began almost immediately to fade into what seemed to Ivy Lou and her mommy and daddy to have been only a bad dream. It all grew fainter and fainter until one day they had forgotten about it entirely. Since they were not at all rich anymore, that great enormous house changed into a smaller house. The playhouse and the beach and the airplane and the horse and the throughway and the car and the ship and the pirates went entirely away, and Ivy Lou did not miss them one bit. She and her parents ended up living in a quite ordinary house, very much like the other houses in the neighborhood, except that theirs had blue shutters, and Daddy and Mommy once again began going to work every day, and there were all of them as happy as they could be. It was just as if they had always lived like that in that pretty white house with the blue shutters. Not one of the neighbors remembered anything else at all. And Ivy Lou had lots and lots of friends, for it seemed she had learned not to be bossy, thanks to her experience of being bossed by the witch, and she went to school and took piano lessons and quite forgot that there had ever been any danger at all of her growing up to be a witch or turning into a porcelain pig. No one ever saw the little star again, but that was all right, for Mommy was there now and had an endless supply of goodnight kisses, one or more of which she gave to Ivy Lou every single night. The end.